Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 11. In the Belruth Hills. The silence was so complete that the least crackling of the flames could be heard clearly by the whole gathering. The walls of the courtyard threw the sound back at them, giving it a strange, echoing quality. Every face was impassive, from the least scullion to the gaunt-faced guardsmen standing frozen in their wedge-shaped formations. No one could muster tears for a queen who had lived such a secluded and separate life for more than 10 cycles. Her departure was almost a relief, as if a sad and tragic episode had finally come to a close. The fire swiftly consumed the raised casket, the wooden platform, and the royal standard above. The oil and incense the priests had used in preparing the pyre masked any unwanted odors with a sweetness Gareth found a little sickening. He was barely 20 paces away from the rolling, boiling mass, and could feel the heat of it on his face. Directly opposite him stood the king. It was impossible to read from his manner or expression what the man felt. The shimmering heat would distort his image from time to time, breaking the mask into something Gareth wanted to believe resembled grief. He wondered at his own lack of feeling. The shock of being informed 3 days previously had passed away without developing into sadness. Was he really sad? He was angry, that he knew, but that was perhaps only because Talon had once more covered the actual events with his shroud of lies. Before the pyre had been lit, the High Quester had described the queen as an unhappy soul whose ill health had driven her to seek comfort in a life of isolation. But it had pleased Imran to allow her a peaceful death in her sleep. A peaceful death. Gareth could see once more the droplets falling into the cup she had taken in desperation to avoid torture and execution. It certainly had been more peaceful than the Quester had planned for her. And there he stood in his black robe, the man who had murdered his mother, next to the man who would not protect her. Could his father have loved her then? Or did her crimes outweigh the love he once had for her? When the flames had receded to an angry red glow, the king withdrew in silence, but without haste. Gareth was not sure whether this reflected his true feelings, or whether he was merely keeping up the role he had been forced to adopt these past cycles. An unreasonable resentment rose in the boy against his father, as if the king alone was to blame for the ruined life that had been his wife's. He heard over and again the frustrated voice, hopeless and threatening, the decision made already. He saw the slight shake of her hands as she lifted the ornate cup, her eyelashes casting odd shadows over the white sepulchral skin of her face. The guardsmen were dismissed, and the crowd dispersed, following them into the castle. Only the priests remained behind to collect the ashes for interment in the crypts below the temple. Talon's twisting of the truth had at least assured her remains a place among the royals. Fengor was in no mood to face the relatives of his departed wife. Much as he had respect and appreciation for the qualities of Count Byrand of Gilreth, he detested his arrogant though able son Garelane. Gary had 35 cycles, as many as the banished Rune, with whom he had formed the younger pair of the adventurous royal party of so many cycles ago. Galad, Fengor's younger brother by 2 cycles, had completed the foursome, lending them his energy and sense of humor. And then Athera had come. Such a sweet girl she had been, 2 cycles younger than her brother. Her very laughter had been intoxicating, and how she had looked at Rune, and he at her. Fierce jealousy had been his master since then. Now the sight of her brother brought him only guilt and pain. They had once been friends in their youth. The tall, fair Nurian had a boisterous and jovial manner that attracted or offended whoever came into contact with him almost instantly, more so the former than the latter. His easygoing nature and his good looks, as well as an exceptional physical strength, won him admirers and followers in any company. There was no doubt that he would make a most worthy successor to his father. He had proven his ability and courage on the field of battle in raids and skirmishes against the Aaronites, but was no butcher that enjoyed the carnage of war. In fact, he had sided with a faction led by his father that pushed for an end to the everlasting hostilities against their former allies. Typical Gilreth doctrine, of course. They never felt the impact of the tenacious raiding parties pouring from the northern passes, lying so far to the east. They never had to contend with the cries for vengeance from the farmsteads and villages around Keris. Fengor was not petty enough to have allowed the promptings of jealousy to ruin his friendship with this man. It had been when Gary had made his displeasure known over the match between the king and Ethera that their paths had diverged irrevocably. For the sake of policy, Fengor had stopped short of outright hatred for his erstwhile friend, even though the latter had openly supported his cursed younger brother Rune in his seduction of the future queen. Whenever his thoughts turned in that direction, the king almost lost his reason in a wave of anger. If he had given way to his ire, Garlane would have accompanied Rune in exile. But Talon had taken charge and averted an almost certain civil war. Fengor had suppressed his wrath. Ethera had been the peace offering, and Byrand had chastened his son. From that time he had detested the traitorous brother-in-law, and even though Ethera was no longer between them, the intensity of his feelings had not diminished. Now they walked through his doorway, their faces clouded, their manner tight and formal. He was well able to match their mood. He nodded politely.
Count Byrand.
The older man inclined his head in return.
My lord king.
Fengor turned to his former friend.
Gary.
Though carrying 35 cycles, Garulane still appeared youthful and energetic.
Fengor.
His mouth formed a slight smile, as was his custom in all humors, and part of the reason for the quick like or dislike engendered in those around him. It made him younger than his cycles, lent a certain playful quality to his features, and gave the lie to the somber tones of his burning garb.
It was most fortunate that you were so close at the time of the Queen's sudden departure. It is never good to delay the burning. Such a turn of events always gives rise to unpleasant whisperings. You were at Tew when the messengers reached you.
Fengor tried to appear casual. Byrand had grown increasingly agitated at the king's words, and only kept his composure with an effort.
Not as fortunate as you might suppose. We knew of Ethera's plans to end it all. We were only too late to prevent her from putting them into effect.
Fengor's flaring eyes betrayed his surprise.
Are you suggesting that—
Gary interrupted him curtly.
Save your indignation, Fengor. We received a letter from Ethera that she had managed to smuggle past your vigilant black crows some days ago. She said her farewell and announced her intention to end her life. There is no need to pretend to us.
His playful smile had been replaced by a slight frown. Fengor glanced from one to the other.
I cannot be held responsible for the actions of a deranged person. This deranged person was my daughter.
The Count took a step closer. His hands were trembling, his face red. Gary laid a restraining hand on his arm.
Father.
No.
The old man shook him off.
I will have my say, here and now.
He made an attempt to control himself.
I will not indict you before a truth council, Fengor, if that is what you fear. I was as much to blame for my daughter's intolerable condition as you were, and do not desire to have every noble in the kingdom wagging his tongue about my affairs. I could not see how to remedy the situation, once I'd given my consent to Talon's mad scheming. I was young enough then still to be impressed by his croaking threats, not to mention the part played by your banished brother.
Here Fingor took in his breath sharply, and Gary looked down at the hilt of his blade. Byrand waved an arm at the king to preempt any interruption.
But I am not one to dwell on the past. What I want from you is the whole truth regarding Aethera's death. I know that she took a poisonous draught, but I want to know what you had to do with that. If your answer does not satisfy me, I swear that I will throw this matter to the council.
Fingor's eyes were blazing.
You dare to threaten me?
Yes, I dare, and in this matter it is not an idle threat.
Byrand's voice was steady. The king stood struggling with himself for a tension-filled minute before replying.
I had nothing to do with her action, except that I condoned it as the only graceful way of ending a life thrown away upon the memory of a worthless scoundrel. She no longer appeared in public. She more or less openly indulged in the art forbidden on pain of death in our laws. I could find no more excuse to offer the questors. She would have been imprisoned, you understand, tortured into a state of misery and shame hard to imagine. Would that have been a better obituary than the lies of Talon?
He looked angrily at the other men, daring them to challenge him.
I would admit here today that marrying her was a mistake.
Despite the child she gave you.
Fingor flinched.
She gave me a child, but never her heart. I already had a son.
And Talon? He would have taken her in spite of knowing the truth?
Perchance because he knew the truth, the king thought to himself, but merely answered.
Talon is a high quester in all its forbidding and uncompromising legalities. You know that.
And no more loyal to the crown than I.
Byrand forced a smile.
Maybe a fraction.
Fingor could not resist the sting, but regretted it immediately. The count became a picture of formality.
I understand your position. My reason told me there was no way out. But I secretly hoped that we would never have this conversation. I regret that this incident has further estranged our hearts from each other. But I assure you that it will in no way impact on the loyalty of Gilreth to the Nurian king.
He deliberately placed an emphasis on his final words. Fingor nodded slowly as if in dismissal.
I wish you a safe and speedy return to your city, Count.
Gary stepped forward in his turn.
There is one other matter.
His smile had returned.
Oh?
The king showed his irritation.
Yes. We wish to be informed of the welfare and progress of Aethera's son.
You go too far.
Once more Fingor felt the blood rush to his head. The very tone of his brother-in-law offended him.
And why would that be? He is my nephew, and the grandson of the Count of Gilreth.
I am perfectly capable of handling this affair, and see no reason why I should give an account to you.
He spat out the last word.
I have placed him under Captain Malvor's personal supervision in the guard. Whatever you have heard in the past...
Count Byrand made an appeasing gesture.
I have no reason to disapprove of your decisions, Fingor. Indeed, I am very pleased that you have placed him in the guard and kept him out of Talon's clutches. You must understand the level of my involvement. I would merely like to be informed, and have no desire to offer you my well-meant advice. But you could not reasonably expect me to take no interest in the boy.
Fingor still glared at the two men as though they had drawn their blades against him.
Of course.
A letter once per season would not inconvenience you?
This was the annoying Garrelane again.
I will instruct the captain.
He made an attempt at returning the smile, but it resembled a grimace more than an expression of mirth or satisfaction. This pained look only faded once the men had taken their leave, and he had dispatched a servant with all haste to fetch the high quester. Gareth flung himself down on his bed. He was disappointed by his own reaction. Maybe it was because he had expected it. He was not relieved, or perplexed, or even sad, as if the entire matter did not concern him in the least. The anger he had felt towards the priests fizzled out to nothing. His father's betrayal was suddenly insignificant compared to his own indifference, his inability even to feel sorry for her. He determined to put the whole matter out of his mind as soon as possible. He never had a mother, and he would not acquire one now only to grieve over her. Yet, as he lay staring at the knotty shapes on the wooden ceiling, The images of that strange interview invaded his mind once more, tearing away at his resolve. There had been real concern on her side, even affection. Then there was the promise and the letter. He rose up quickly and retrieved it from its hiding place. He seated himself on the bed. There it was, the same insubstantial writing, spelling his name. He sniffed at it. Did it smell of her? He tried to remember the conversation he had had with her 20 days before. He could see the room still in vivid detail. There was no distinct smell he could recall. He wished that she had never given it to him. It would have been so much easier to forget her. He dreaded breaking the seal and folding it open, dreaded the meaning he would find inside. Everything about her had only caused him distress. The shadows were lengthening, the sun having crept behind the high walls opposite, but there was still enough light by which to read. He sat a few moments longer, biting his lip. Then he drew himself up on the bed and swiftly opened it, tilting it towards the fading glow.
My son,
you
you are too young to read.
are too young to read this.
I cannot hope that you
will understand, but I dare delay no longer, or this letter will remain unwritten. Imran knows it is no easy matter. I am bound by an oath from disclosing the greater part of what you have a right to know. I will keep my word as far as it is possible for me to do so. I was forced to part with you at your birth, and at the time I was lost in the deepest despair. I longed only for death. The parting with you was not the sole cause of my condition, but certainly added to my distress. I am a weakling, you must understand, and I could not face truth, regardless of where my lies would eventually
I have been in that
imprison
prison
me.
too long now.
I have been in that
And
prison
perchance
too
it has
long
robbed
now,
me of my
and
reason,
perchance
as
it has
some would
robbed
hold.
me of my
Reason, as some would hold.
When
When they returned you to me, 2 seasons after the stillbirth of your brother,
I had regained some
I
semblance
had
of
regained
normality,
some semblance
living
of
as the king's
normality,
wife.
living as the king's wife.
Seeing you
Seeing you
again,
again,
only as a little baby,
Only as a little
plunged me
baby,
back into the
plunged me
intolerable
back into
memories
the
I had
intolerable
ineffectually tried to
memories
suppress.
I had ineffectually
Please do
tried
not
to
think
suppress.
that you were the cause
Please
of
do
my
not
sorrow.
think that you were the cause of my sorrow.
If only I had been stronger, you would have been the greatest joy to me. Yet I could not take you in my arms and stay sane.
I could not
bear thinking of you, for my mind would be overcome by visions of what I would never have again, of what has been stolen from me. Even now, after all the seasons that have slipped by, the pain of it is too much to bear. I have to live with my own betrayal. I could blame others for my neglect of you, but that would be only partially true. I buried myself in the forbidden arts, bending time and distance to my will, forcing the fog to clear before my gaze. I gave it my strength and my desires, forever searching, but a spectator at best. Sometimes when I would find him, I felt the excitement of a young girl again, who goes out at night to meet a lover in secret. When I could not, I cried for days, locked in my room. No wonder they thought me mad. The High Questor suspected, though. He has questioned me several times, and has all the evidence he needs. Only Fengor has restrained him from destroying me. Questor Talon is a dangerous man, my son. Beware of him. He knows about your past. He bears you ill will. Never trust him. I beg the king not to let you fall into his hands. I wish that I could tell you whom to trust, but there is no one, not even the king. I can no longer see his intentions.
The
older prince hates you. Take care not to offend either of these men. 3 days ago I saw you from my garden window. I had already decided to make an end and was at peace. But the sight of you gnawed at my conscience. I am leaving you alone, surrounded by enemies with no protection. That has been my lot also, but I brought it upon myself. You are innocent, my poor son, and should not suffer for the crimes of your mother.
for the crimes of your mother.
It will be better for
It will
you
be
when I am
better
no
for
longer
you
there to
when
inflame
I
the
am no
opinions of
longer
the
here
priests
to
against
inflame
us.
the opinions of the
Stay away from the
priests
art,
against
Gareth.
us.
It will only bring you harm.
Stay away from the art, Gareth. It will only bring you harm.
I am trapped.
I am trapped.
I will do what they
I will
desire
do
of
what
me
they
without
desire of me
reluctance.
without reluctance.
I
I long for rest.
It is not difficult.
It is
for me
not
to go.
difficult for me to go.
I leave only two
I
regrets.
leave only two regrets.
I
should have fled when I had the opportunity. I should have embraced you regardless of the consequences. Please understand that once I had embarked on my course, I was unable to turn, not unwilling. This I swear to you on my soul. I am sorry, Gareth. Sorry that I could not find the courage to protect you as a mother should have. I only pray that someday you will find it in you to forgive me. Athera Seth Byrand of Gilruth. Third day of Suntide, 598, post-summoning.
Gareth buried his face in his hands over the parchment. He loved her. He always had hoped to, longed to, and he hated her because she had let him believe her mask of indifference, her feigned insanity. He had been an outsider to her, only allowed into her life when it no longer mattered. Now both love and hate had no more relevance. They congealed into a terrible numbing sadness that he had not felt at her burning, and the tears he had not been able to shed slowly ran between his fingers to smudge the cruel ink. It was fully dark before he felt inclined to get up and do her last bidding. He fumbled in the dark for the flint, and while he struck it suddenly remembered the ease with which she had brought light into her own room. Yet another lie of the priests, asserting that the successful execution of commands was subject to the wearing of a black robe and eons of devoted training exclusively. His mother had conjured forth the energy of the stones without these. But then she had admitted to studying the art. If only there was someone to teach him. He sighed as the torch in the wall sconce lazily flowered into flame. The paper was dry and burned well. He held it till it was almost consumed, then let the end slip from his fingers into the hungry flames. It seemed somehow fitting that the letter followed her into airy smoke. He could make little sense of it. It was clear that she had not wanted him because of some past tragedy she was unwilling to disclose anything about. Yet another mystery had separated them when he was born, hidden circumstances that would turn his father against him and earn him the hatred of his brother. But he had done them no harm. He had been a baby, unaware. She had wanted to protect him. She did not despise him, but they had stolen something from her, and thus stolen something from him. Somehow this knowledge brought no more comfort than her supposed insanity. It was best to forget her, if only he would be able. He was seated on the window-sill in his nightshirt when Den returned. It was late, the hunter already brushing the battlements in the west with a glittering hand. He stared at it, mesmerized, little sparks of life flickering in the massive black void. That was perhaps what men were, except their lives were so much shorter and less significant. His friend stepped up to the sill and cleared his throat. Gareth turned to stare at him.
I'm sorry.
Den kept his eyes on the younger boy's face to gauge his mood. Gareth looked away.
Don't be. Everyone knows it's better this way. Perchance they will have less to say about me now, eh?
He smiled ruefully. There was no answering smile. Den looked tired and depressed.
Perchance.
He shrugged and turned away.
Where have you been?
Den slumped onto his bed.
I thought I'd leave you alone for a while.
He made as though to continue, and then seemed to think better of it. The silence became uncomfortable. He rose up again to undress.
You have seen the priests again?
The boy whirled to face him, dropping the surcoat to the floor. The bewilderment on his face gave him away.
Why would you say that?
It is true, then.
No, of course not.
Den brought a slightly shaking hand to his throat in an odd, nervous gesture.
Then it was a jest merely. Why do you stare so?
Gareth was surprised at the reaction to his statement. It was unpleasant to discover that his friend was keeping some secret contact with the questers after all.
It matters not if you speak to them.
I did not speak to them, I tell you.
It was too late for him to shrug the matter off as a triviality. He felt compelled to defend himself. Gareth stepped down and quickly got into bed. He was more hurt by this small betrayal than he would have anticipated, and thought himself silly. He did not know how to disperse the tension and simply kept quiet, staring at the knotty faces on the ceiling again. Den made no effort either. He glumly continued his undressing, not looking at Gareth, who had placed his hands behind his head and seemed fascinated by the familiar pattern overhead. The shadow of the older boy fell over him for a moment or two, while the former snuffed out the light. He listened to the irritated movements in the dark, and turned his face to the wall. The strained atmosphere lingered for 6 more days. Gareth went through his first taste of physical training in a daze. He felt himself hopelessly inadequate in matching the older boy's superior strength and ability. Moreover, he was sluggish in his movements, and incurred the wrath of Master Grayson for his lack of enthusiasm. The other trainees were reluctant to pair off with him on account of who he was, and for fear of injuring the smaller boy. But he purposely misread their intentions as an attempt to isolate and display their dislike for him. He saw Den at mealtimes, but they hardly spoke a word to each other outside the superficial exchanges between former friends. He fell into alternating states of daydreaming and self-pity. His father again seemed to have forgotten that he existed. He could have found an excuse for this by crediting the man with being overcome with grief, or even the pressing affairs of state that had not been the pattern for so many cycles. There was but one thing to look forward to, his escape into the hills on the 10th day. He centered his thoughts on it, and kept it as a glimmering jewel in his mind. He wondered constantly what would happen once he moved onto Master Pleo's group for instruction in blade skills. How would he go about it without a weapon of his own? Euban had evaded all questions neatly, and only admitted after an hour that the worst would be for him to train with a light metal sword. And then again, most every trainee started with metal practice blades. Who knows? When he was older, perhaps. With this, he had had to be satisfied. He refused to be, however, and merely stubbornly included the old man as part of the conspiracy against him. He had not the wisdom to realize that the Queen's death had affected him more than he would have believed possible. While she had lived, there had been the half-formed hope that she could have revived from her melancholy, dreamlike state, and he would have had the chance to know her. This little light had taken its leave, tinting his thoughts in a darker shade, adding to the gloom in which he now cloaked everything around him. Only the green hillsides and the sun sparks on the river remained bright and open, a refuge. He took to his room after supper, where he seated himself on the wide stone windowsill, and stared till the stars formed themselves into discernible shapes of meaning. But no strange images fermented in his mind to fade familiar things into what he longed to see. Thus he would remain, thinking of nothing in particular, till Den bade him a casual good night, and afterwards there were no dreams to trouble his sleep. He was engaged in this reverie on the eve of his escape, the next day being the magical 10th, when Den arrived much earlier than had been his custom since the burning. He made an effort to appear comradely and jovial, but his manner immediately struck a false note, since he could not succeed in concealing his nervousness. When he could not engage the surly boy in conversation, he sighed and turned away. Gareth felt a pang of regret, and watched him light the lamp, though it was not necessary as yet. The little flame did not even cast a glow on the freckled face. Den stared at its lazy stirring, his chin rested on his palms, his somewhat delicate fingers framing his visage. Gareth noticed the dark hollows of his eyes, the tired droop of his mouth, and forgot about his own moodiness. He turned his back to the open window, swinging his legs into the room.
What ails you?
Den did not look up.
There are things I have to tell you.
His eyes were locked on the flame.
You can keep a secret, of course.
He stood up to shut the door, and then turned his back to it.
Tell me, Gareth. What do you know of Captain Malvor's son?
Garrett?
Yes.
Den walked back to his bed and sat down on it.
I did not know him, but I saw him often enough. He was lively and merry, perchance a little mischievous. I know they killed him for some sacrilege. I'm not sure what. I thought it most unfair at the time.
He went into the temple to touch the stone.
I see.
There was an awkward silence. Then the older boy continued.
He was my friend. He often dragged me into his adventures, but I was not like him. I hated getting into trouble on his account, being punished when it was not my fault but his. He was brave, but also reckless, perhaps a bit of a fool.
He shrugged.
Then came the temple thing. I knew from the start it was doomed to failure. One does not simply disregard a law as important as that and then joke about it afterwards.
He pressed his lips together.
Did he touch it?
He did, yes, but they saw him do it, and he was trapped.
How had they known?
Gareth already suspected the truth.
I was the one who told them. Told him where he had gone.
He uttered the words with a shudder and looked away immediately.
You what?
I thought they would stop him. I didn't know what they would do.
His voice rose a little.
I begged him not to go. I warned him that I would tell, but he laughed at me. He called me a coward, and many other things besides. I was angry and hurt, and when he left with his forged key, I went to the priest.
He paused as if for a reply, and when none came, he buried his face in his hands.
They didn't stop him, just followed him, as if they wanted to trap him in the temple.
He was trembling all over now, as if the confession was causing its own bitter elation.
And you still trust him?
Gareth did not have to exaggerate his surprise. Then looked at him sharply.
No, they know better than I do. It's not a question of trust. It's just...
His eyes were wide, unveiling the abjection to which he had been driven by these long pent-up emotions. Remorse had had no avenue of expression until now.
Who can you believe in, if not the priests? They act for the good of all, don't they? Don't they?
The eyes were begging for understanding, and with it a degree of absolution. For a moment the terrible void of doubt yawned beneath both of them. They stared at each other. What could offer one a surety to be followed without question? Gareth thought of what he had seen in the temple and elsewhere. Would it ever be more than a dream?
Why are you telling me this?
His voice was low. Then looked away.
I fear for you.
Then, in no more than a whisper,
I think they want you dead.
Who?
The Questers.
he glanced towards the closed door.
Why? What have I done?
Gareth's own voice was a hoarse whisper. He was cold with shock. The older boy merely shrugged and stared at him dumbly.
How do you know this?
They know you go into the hills when you can. They told me to make sure that you go again this coming 10th day.
Gareth forced a smile.
That does not mean...
You did not see them. It was like that other time, when I told them, and they decided to kill him. They are the same now, as if they had just received their grant at the feast.
But they did not say I was to be killed.
Realization suddenly struck him.
Is it because I touched the stone?
You've been presented.
No, before that. I touched it 2 days before that.
Den regarded him steadily.
You needn't look at me like that. I didn't know, so I could not have told them.
I wasn't thinking that. Others knew. The storemaster.
It makes no difference. You cannot go tomorrow, that's all. And then I will have to tell them that I warned you.
What would you do that for?
You do not understand. No one can keep secrets from the questers. They know when you are hiding something, and they always find out in the end.
Well, you can tell them the truth this time, because I am going to the hills tomorrow.
Den gaped at him.
Didn't you hear what I said?
Yes, but you just feel there may be danger for me. You don't know for sure. And I have been waiting too long already.
You cannot be this foolish. What do you think they want you out there for? You admitted that they hate you.
They would not dare attack me.
He sniggered.
Besides, have you ever seen a priest in the hills? He certainly couldn't get very far.
Gods, it can't be true. I thought you had more sense than this. They have others who can do their bidding just as easily.
And face a truth council? Not even the priests are that foolish.
He smiled at Den.
You cannot slay the king's son close to Belruth and expect to get away with it.
Say what you like. I will not have your death on my conscience also. You may despise me as a coward, but I cannot see you going out there tomorrow.
Suddenly, Gareth understood. Den would have to see another friend fall prey to the insidious designs of the questers, in whose scheming he had been involved since the episode with Garrett. Now he was disobeying their instructions in a way he had not the craft to keep from them. His action was not only courageous, but selfless.
You are not a coward.
He said slowly.
You are brave indeed to tell me what you have, and be ready to face them again.
He stared at the other boy, a little numbed by the sudden confession. He saw the terrible price of it on his face, and realized that he could not simply throw this warning to the winds. He rose from the sill and seated himself next to Den on the bed.
I'll be the coward tomorrow, and heed your advice.
Den held his eyes fixedly, testing the sincerity of his words. Half his face was hidden in the growing evening, half of it lit by the lamplight. He stared for a minute before smiling tiredly.
I am fated to befriend the enemies of the state.
Am I your friend, Den?
Gareth stood up.
Is that why you told me?
Den rose with him and gripped his shoulder in response.
I did it for me, too.
It was mid-morning before he could give Den the slip and make his way through the sheep gate. He had a vivid image of a bitterly disappointed Riot moping next to the swimming hole to fuel his haste. Nevertheless, he proceeded down the familiar tracks with caution, often pausing to listen or stepping off the pathway into the roadside shadows. He was uneasy, but convinced himself it had more to do with Den's warning than his own senses. He did not believe the priests would do him mischief almost under the walls of Belruth. Even if they had hired assassins to dispose of him, the Truth Council would make short work of such ruffians as would lay their hands on a king's son. Then the masters of the plot would also be exposed, though the very pinnacle of evil was known. No Nurian in his right mind would risk such a thing. He turned aside to his mirror pool, moving as quietly as possible through the thick undergrowth. His uneasiness intensified with every step, even in the familiar darkness. He sat for a moment, leaning against the ancient air. The water was quiet, unmoving, yet he could not shake the pressing apprehension, as if the very air was heavier than usual. It was perhaps the sun-tide heat, though he had not considered it a particularly oppressive morning. Mayhap a storm was brewing. There was nothing here to make him linger today, but yet he felt a great reluctance to leave the gloom and return to the sheep track. He thought of Den's words and felt the nervous tugging in the pit of his stomach. He had to see Riot. Back in the light of day, he broke into a trot, till the track widened into hilly pasturage. Instead of settling him, the run made him more apprehensive. He roundly cursed the priests, whose threatening presence could follow him even here, and make him jump at his own shadow. Could his friend have been instructed to bring him the warning? Had they hoped to deter him from venturing into the hills? It was not possible, or Den was the best actor in all of Nuria. He walked slowly to steady his breathing, and look for tracks that seemed out of place. It was hard to listen for snapping twigs under a booted foot, when one's heartbeats were drumming so loudly in one's ears. The bathing pool was deserted, so was the shady bank bordering it. He had expected this. It was too early yet for his friend to seek the coolness under the trees. He turned away from the water, skirting a copse of needle trees. His gaze stabbed in every direction. His mouth was unconsciously open to aid his straining ears. There was nothing out of cater, no menace in the unmoving morning air. He followed an invisible path, contouring a small hill to the left. Something moved in the undergrowth to his right. He whirled round and sat down on his haunches, staring at the spot where he had detected the movement. As he did so, a peculiar cry set his teeth on edge. Frantic struggles in the undergrowth followed. Then the cry rose up again. He thought of mad flight down the way he had come for a second or two, before he spotted the matted fleece of a sheep, thoroughly entangled. It cried again forlornly. He stood up with a hollow laugh to himself. His nerves were evidently worn thin. If Riot had seen him ducking wildly like that, he would have laughed till his sides hurt. The thought of it broke the horrible tension for a moment or two. He forced his way through the thicket to reach the struggling animal, but at his approach the sheep rolled its eyes and threshed about frenziedly. He spoke to it gently, and freed it from the tangles without laying hands on it. It was badly hurt, or extremely fatigued, for it ceased its frantic attempts at escape and merely stared at him with half-rolled-back eyes. He would have something to say to Riot for allowing one of his sheep to get itself into such a condition. Then he noticed the blood. At first he thought that the animal had merely grazed itself, and the blood matting the underside of its fleece had issued from a gash or cut. But when he examined it carefully, he discovered the broken hind leg and the torn flesh. Only a wild animal, like a wolf or a bear, could have injured it in this manner. How could Riot allow this to happen? There was danger here after all, though not in the form he had expected it. Once more apprehension ran riot through his mind. He left the sheep quivering in the underbrush and struggled back to the pathway. Where was Riot? The contouring soon brought him into a miniature valley, narrowing away into a gorge. A steep grassy hillside formed the one side, the other was a wooded slope, virtually impassable. A gnawing fear made him light-headed. Somewhere a little trickle of water indicated a side stream making its way to the dark weed. Atop the grassy hill, a mass of air shoved its long dead branches up to the sky. There was something horribly familiar about the whole setting. He forced his feet slowly up the slope, noticing the nightmare signs of struggle, the dragging smear of blood through the flattened grass. He could no longer think of a lurking danger, a deadly threat hiding in the shadows. His mind was numb with realization. He rounded an outcrop of stone, and was saved from the asp only because he had startled it. The warning hiss brought him up short. He saw its writhing threat, the triangular green head with its slits of eyes swaying this way and that. It was not a particularly large specimen, but the hidden fangs would be just as dangerous. It disappeared into a crack after he had cast the stone at it. The tree loomed above him. He rushed up to confront whatever was there, the cry already formed in his throat. The body was cradled in a fork, about 5 feet from the ground. The face turned towards him, staring with empty sockets. An arm dangled down, badly bruised and lacerated, soiled with dirt and dried blood. He was not aware of approaching. but saw the broken body, ribs splayed open and gutted like an animal. There was dried blood splattered everywhere, and the flies had already found the corpse. He dropped to his knees and was violently sick. He tried to stand up but was oddly unbalanced. He had to have closed his eyes, for he felt the lids were loath apart, as if the hours of sleep had been too few and the morning a cold one. When they separated unwillingly, he saw the few wisps of cloud in the blue dome. The long grass obscured his view on either side, pressing softly against his cheeks and temples as he gazed upwards. He drew in its perfume, mingled with the dank smell of soil as an opiate. When he could stir his heavy limbs again and dragged himself to his knees, it was impossible to look up at the tree. Near the bole, among the twisting roots, lay a broken girdle, its clasp golden and bright. A startling realization ran through him, and he heard a familiar voice in his mind. Wear it all the time. But he had not. He had passed it on to a friend for a while. There is only one such in all the realm, and now it was broken, and its wearer ripped to pieces. By what? He could think of no wild animals that ripped its prey like this, and still lurked in the Belruth hills. This had been the work of filthy, murderous men, and there was no doubt that he had been the intended victim. Behind this terrible deed stood his own brother, Lucain, though he was far away in Lysan. Behind it stood the cold priests, perhaps his father. How could it be possible? His father had to have known, had to have agreed to it. The hideous murder of his own son. Had he gone insane? Who else was involved? The whole of Belruth? Hubin, Den, Gwir, Brido, and Gwilla? His head was spinning with it. They hated him because of his mother. They had killed her and Riot, and now they wanted his body torn and bleeding. All their gestures, all their words became murmurings of betrayal. The hills themselves were traitors. They had lulled him with their beauty, been his joy for cycles, only to deliver him to this day's sight. He had to get away, escape the fate they had intended for him, escape their falseness, and above all, escape the scene on this hill with which he could never come to terms. Moreover, the vicious men could still be prowling the hills and find him here. He started running, down the far side of the hill, crazily sprinting away in long strides, till the trees closed in on him, and his own tiredness conspired with the undergrowth to slow him to a walk. He had covered several miles before he reached another tiny tributary of the Darkweed, and stopped to refresh himself. Where was he running? He had no idea. He had to escape from the impossible tree and the deceitful stones of Belruth. Little else mattered. It was chilly in the little gorge in which he had stopped. No sound disturbed its semi-dark shelter of green, except the endless argument of water over rounding rock. He could feel the damp cold of the large stone on which he perched through the seat of his hose. Dead leaves lay scattered everywhere, a carpet of decay. He stared at the mossy patterns on the tree trunks, till they blurred into dull dark smudges, and he felt to his surprise the warm tears on his cheeks. For a moment he wanted to give in to the cavernous pain, and sob like a little child, but a sudden sound behind him brought him to his feet. He hurriedly drew a sleeve across his eyes and glanced around him, quivering like a wild animal. Perhaps it had only been a hare or a small antelope, but he would not linger to find out. He cleared the stream in a leap and broke through the trees on the opposite side. The morning was hungry and hopeless. The momentum of the previous day's horror had all but disappeared with the light of a new dawn. Now he needed a direction in which to plod, a destination to hope for, and something for the emptiness of his stomach. He was a good day's march to the west of Belruth, for he had continued his weary course for about 2 hours after Imran had drawn his oar below the horizon. Then he had crawled into a ferny hollow and slept fitfully. A quick search yielded a few berries for his morning meal. He ate them slowly while deciding on a course of action. Would they have discovered their mistake by now? The murderers had probably reported their mission's success before the end of the noon watch. For the sake of prudence, the priests would not have sent out someone to look for him till nightfall. With any luck, the body would not be discovered till morning. Then it would take more time to piece together the events and realize that the simultaneous disappearance of a certain shepherd boy might be connected. Even so, they could not be certain that it was his or Riot's body they had found. They would have to search the hills nonetheless, for the lost shepherd boy and for the supposed brigands. They would use hunting dogs, and perchance discover his trail. Either way, he would not turn back towards Belruth, for they would certainly not let him escape them again. He would have to keep moving westwards. But where would that lead him? To Keris? And the pass? And afterwards? He could not hide in the mountains forever. He needed someone to trust, someone who would keep his identity a secret. Yet the priests were everywhere. He would have to live perpetually in fear of them, afraid to show himself in public. How could they hate him so? There was his grandfather. The Count of Gilreth might shelter him, if he could ever reach the eastern lands. His mother had not mentioned him as a potential ally in her letter. He may be part of the plot, and seeking him out would play neatly into the hands of the priests and his father. The thought of the latter numbed his mind for a moment, and he sat staring dumbly at the crimson stains the berries had left on his hands. How could a father want to destroy his own son? Why would his brother hate him so? Were they all insane? Or were there too many aspects of the past he knew nothing about? He thought again of the letter that had told him so little. I am bound from disclosing the greater part of what you have a right to know. What did he have a right to know? Why could she not break her oath? Did he have to die as a sheep and not even know why? He got up, more than a little dizzy on account of all the unanswered questions, and trudged off with the morning sun on his back. The village of Lunvier was walled and fortified. Being so close to the western passes, it had seen countless Aeronite raids from weaker parties, lacking the nerve to assault the garrison town of Keris. Attacking the farmsteads in the vicinity of Lunvier was a tempting alternative. The town itself could easily hold off the raiders till a force arrived from Belruth to the east, or Gerdel to the south. As soon as the beacons blazed at Keris, the farmers would gather their valuables and as much livestock as permitted by the law, and make for the stone walls of Lunvier. Here they would arm themselves and join the villagers, trusting in the strong iron of the gate and the width of the walls for their lives. Even during times of relative quiet, the gate was shut at night, and though he arrived just before nightfall and was weak with hunger, Gareth did not commit the indiscretion of entering the town. Instead, he skirted its northern edge, making his way along a dry stream bed under cover of ancient needle trees. The air was moving from the south, and brought with it the maddening aroma of cooking. The villagers were preparing their evening meals, oblivious of the starving runaway. How strange it was that he could not dare approach them for help, who 3 days before would have defended him with life and limb. Now he could not risk asking for their aid. There would be questions he could not answer, and somewhere inside the walls lurked a black-robed priest. 2 miles to the west he caught the enticing smell of a freshly prepared meal once again. It was nearly dark, and he could make out the companionable flickering of a fire. He was about ready to throw caution to the wind, for during his 3 days of walking he had had little more than a few handfuls of berries to live on. Here might be a chance to appropriate an unguarded loaf or two. He headed in the direction of the glow, approaching tentatively. It was a lumber camp, with several sprawling tents and an open cooking fire. There was no one about, but he could hear the splashing and laughter through the trees as the dozen or so woodcutters washed away the day's dust before supper. Certainly they would have more than enough to spare. An old dog growled half-heartedly at him, but turned friendly after he had seated himself on his haunches and coaxed it towards him. The lumbermen had ample provisions with them. In the cook's tent, some short distance from the fire, you could make out baskets of fresh loaves from the town, casks of ale, strings of onions, and various crated live animals. In a moment he had filled an empty sack with half a dozen loaves. The smell from outside was too much to resist, though, and he grabbed an old wooden bowl that might have been used by the dog, wiped it with the sack, and ladled as much of the stew as it would take into it. Then he beat a hasty retreat, scarcely believing his luck. It was the best meal he had ever had, of that he was sure. The broth contained large, meaty chunks, and was seasoned with leeks and onions. The bread acclaimed the more than adequate abilities of the Lundveer bakers in crispy white perfection. He only leaned back with a sigh of satisfaction after he had cleaned out the bowl with his third loaf. Perhaps he should have been more prudent with his only provisions, but he had been unable to stop himself. He struggled to his feet once more and headed deeper into the forest, putting some distance between himself and his benefactors. He had another loaf in the morning, after locating a pool where he could have a proper wash. Then he removed his boots, girdle, and leather bracers, carefully estimated the depth, and plunged headlong into the cold water. He moved to the shallows, shivering, his clothes dragging on him. One by one he removed the garments and rinsed them thoroughly. Then he clambered out and spread them, and himself, out on a rock to dry in the sun. It was time he decided what to do. He would have to find some place to belong, where he could live anonymously. At once he thought of the ocean. It was easy to imagine working for some fisherman, especially since his experience of the sea was very limited. Some tiny village along the coast would be the ideal place to hide. Perhaps later, when his father and brother had died, and Quester Talon had rotted from sheer meanness, he could return to Belruth, and no one would know him. For a while he imagined himself grown tall and strong, striding into the castle as a rich merchant. He had to smile at this dream. But then the inevitable old priest invaded his happy little hideout, and the tree tilted above him on the hillside. He winced and turned over on his stomach. No, he would find no refuge in Nuria. He would go to Keris, and then over the pass into Arran. Mayhap they would welcome him, if they knew that the Nurians wanted him dead. He could tell them many things, make himself valuable to them, but they could torture him, and steal all his secrets in a day. He could pretend to be a plain runaway servant who knew very little. Wouldn't they simply kill him? Was that worse than what the priests intended? He sighed and sat up. His perch on the rock was growing uncomfortable. Whichever direction he took, he would probably be killed soon. Better to be killed by the Arranites than by the filth who had murdered Riot.